Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to this very important topic. It is encouraging that members of the House share the interests of our government and all Canadians in maintaining high standards for peace, security, and human rights. A key priority of Canada's foreign policy is the maintenance of peace and security, and in line with that, Canada has some of the strongest export controls in the world that are very much in line with those of our allies and security partners. All exports of controlled goods and technology, including military goods, are carefully reviewed to ensure that they are consistent with these objectives, as well as with other key foreign policy objectives, such as the protection of human rights. In addition, our government is enhancing the rigor and transparency of Canada's export controls with respect to military and strategic goods and technology. As the Minister of Foreign Affairs stated earlier this year, the government is undertaking measures in a number of different areas. First, we will be joining the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty, ATT. This treaty aims to stop unregulated arms transfers, which intensify and prolong conflict and creates common international standards for the export of weapons. In order to do this, we will make all of the necessary changes to legislation and regulation to be able to implement all of the treaty's obligations. It is important to recognize that Canada meets nearly all of these obligations already. However, some additional work is required. And that being said, I would like to underline that the treaty, in fact, was designed to bring other countries up to the high standards of export controls that Canada already has in place. The criteria that we currently use to assess export permit applications, which have been implemented through policy for many years, will now be a legal requirement. Canada also implement controls on brokering activities by Canadians who facilitate transfers of arms between third countries. This is a new regulatory area for Canada, and we are consulting with industry and NGOs on how best to implement this obligation. We will introduce legislation to enact the necessary changes with the goal of ensuring that Canada has all the necessary laws and regulations in place so that we can accede to the Arms Trade Treaty in 2017. Mr. Speaker, we are also making changes to improve transparency, specifically by making more information about exports of military and strategic goods available to Canadians. Annual reports on how the Export and Import Permits Act is being administered and annual reports on exports of military goods from Canada will now be more transparent, more user-friendly, and more informative, and they will be tabled in Parliament on time beginning next year. Of note, on June 17th of this year, at the same time as the Arms Trade Treaty was being tabled in the House of Commons, the government also cleared the decks from the previous government and published the 2014 and 2015 reports on exports of military goods and technology from Canada. As the Minister of Foreign Affairs confirmed, these reports will now have a fixed date for publication and that this date will be enshrined in legislation for May 31st each and every year. Mr. Speaker, these are substantial improvements over past reports, but we intend to go further. Relevant stakeholders, including NGOs and industry, are being consulted on how we can make these reports even more informative, transparent, and easier to understand for the Canadian public. Our goal is to provide additional facts, content, context, and explanation so as to make the reports clearer and more useful to all readers. While we will do all that we can to provide as much information as possible to enhance transparency, we must do so in a fashion that will not harm Canadian business interests or negatively impact either competitiveness or the livelihood of ordinary Canadians who are employed in this important commercial sector. Mr. Speaker, this issue is very important to me as a Member of Parliament for London West. Many of my constituents work at General Dynamics Land Systems, located in the riding of London Fanshawe. These hard-working Canadians and their families rely on jobs created by this regional employer. JDLS, the 8th largest regional employer, hires over 2,400 people and approximately 2,100 employees in the London and Edmonton facilities. They are our local and global leaders in light armoured vehicle platform and subsection integration. They have over 35 years of experience in supporting and protecting our soldiers. During the election campaign, I was asked by a number of constituents if a Liberal government would sacrifice the jobs at JDLS because of concerns with the deal made with Saudi Arabia. I said during the campaign, and I have continued to say without wavering, that I would do all that I can to continue to support the jobs at JDLS. Canada has a strong history working with the defence industry. My father worked at Avro Aero in the 1950s as a draftsman, working on the engine of this amazing aircraft. He was one of the 5,000 employees who lost their jobs on that infamous day when the Conservative government decided to turn their back on Avro Aero. I won't let that happen again. JDLS Canada relies on the Government of Canada to set trade and export policies under which they conduct their business. Defence goods are among the most highly regulated export commodity in Canada. JDLS Canada exports in full compliance with the laws and regulations of the Government of Canada. Canadians expect an export control system that is rigorous, transparent, and predictable, and that's what we deliver. We are delivering on our campaign commitment by joining the Arms Trade Treaty, thus promoting responsible, transparency, and accountability in regulating the global trade of conventional weapons. This is the right thing to do. We are committed to the jobs at General Dynamics Land Systems, unlike members in the third party who are now turning their backs on the thousands of workers in the London region who count on these jobs. Mr. Speaker, we are confident that we can find the right balance between safeguarding the commercial interests of Canadian businesses and delivering on our commitment to further enhance the rigor and transparency of the export control process and accede to the Arms Trade Treaty. This treaty is the result of growing international concern about the direct and indirect consequences of the global arms trade conflict, human rights and development. The ATT does not restrict the type and quantity of arms that a country can export, but requires that these be exported in a responsible manner. It is aimed at ensuring that individual states have an effective export control system in place to regulate the legitimate arms trade, while at the same time using transparency measures to combat the illicit trade. The ATT sets out robust global rules to stop the flow of weapons, munitions, and related items to countries when it is known that they would be used for truly horrific purposes, including genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. It requires all its states parties to assess the export of conventional weapons to a high standard to ensure that they are not used to commit human rights abuses, to violate international humanitarian law, or contribute to international terrorism or organized crime. For the first time, it specifically requires that states also assess their exports against the risk that they would be used to commit serious acts of gender-based violence or violence against women and children, seeking to protect those who are so often the victims in the use of conventional weapons. It is important to note that the ATT does not require its member states to automatically halt all exports to countries with challenging records on human rights or other areas of concern. Rather, it must assess the risk of an individual export being used for nefarious purposes and consider options to mitigate this risk. In other words, states must apply due diligence in considering exports and consider both the risks and benefits of the export of conventional arms. The ATT also requires transparency and efforts to prevent diversion of weapons. This is critical in the fight to prevent the illicit transfer of conventional weapons. These weapons, when traded illegally, too often fall into the hands of those who do not respect human rights or who commit acts of terrorism. It is now essential that we rejoin our international partners and allies in their collective effort through the Arms Trade Treaty. Indeed, Canada is the only NATO ally and only G7 partner not to have signed or ratified the treaty. This is neither in keeping with our Canadian values nor our broader policy objectives of reducing conflict and instability, promoting human rights, and countering terrorism. Acceding to the Arms Trade Treaty will complement Canada's existing engagement on the responsible trade of conventional arms. It will allow Canada to be more effective and to work multilaterally in its quest for a more transparent and accountable arms trade, not only here in Canada, but throughout the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question